Please join me in welcoming Louise Prowse. And Louise is going to talk about the museum moment, heritage walks and the main street.
So the talk I'm giving tonight, it's drawing together a few different threads from my PhD, which looks at different themes of revitalisation in country towns during the 20th century. So I've looked at these, actually, three things: museums, heritage walks and main street separately. So I thought I'd pull them together for you tonight and see what questions come out of it. By 1965, the newly formed Gundagai Historical Society already had a growing problem. They had enough bric-a-brac, everything from leg irons to butter churns, to form a local history display, but they had no museum. Eventually the society settled on a block of land, down from the main street and just up from the Murrumbidgee Flat. The society later emphasised the significance of this site, identifying it as the place where Yarri, a local Aboriginal man, launched his canoe to save drowning residents from the disastrous 1852 flood that wiped out much of the original town and reportedly killed 1/3 of its residents. The museum officially opened in 1965 to a great crowd of residents and descendants of old Gundagai. It was proclaimed by the society and the local newspaper, the Gundagai Independent, to be a tourist attraction that would hopefully counter the effects of the proposed highway bypass and the popularity of the Dog on the Tucker Box site, which was, not surprisingly, located 5 miles from Gundagai's town proper. The Society's presidential report for 1966 stated that over 5,000 people had walked through the doors within the museum's first year. By 1967, the Gundagai's Historical Society reported that countless exhibits were already threatening to overflow the museum. The museum would expand greatly in its lifetime, and these slides here document that growth. The archway that you can see there, which is an addition from the 1965 shot, was actually from a bank that was demolished in 1965, and the bank paid to have that erected in front of the museum. And as you can see, now it's actually been adapted through another building into the museum. But despite this growing museum and a growing tourism market in Gundagai, the museum unfortunately would never gain the popularity of its opening moment. This paper is concerned with the changing spaces that the past has experienced in and engaged with in country towns. I will begin with the museum moment, a period during the 1960s when residents stopped striving for the ideal of progress and instead started to commemorate it. I will then explore the challenges faced by local history museums in the 1970s, with the growth of professionalised heritage, and consider how the popularity of heritage walks contribute to the increased focus on the main street as a place to experience the past. Lastly, I will discuss how the beautification projects of main streets from the mid-1980s and the Main Street program beginning in 1988 consolidated this shift and also contributed to the diminishing popularity of engaging with the rural past in folk museums. This paper stops there, as the next stage would be researching the growth of heritage-listed B&Bs and food produce tourism, such as historic wineries, and no one has given me any funding for these trips yet. This paper argues that residents' and tourists' appetite for the visual past has contributed to the expansion of places where the past is engaged in. Initially content with viewing the past within a museum context, heritage walks and eventually the main street would become more popular sites in which to not only imagine the past but to move through it. The 1960s were a boom time for historical societies. While they existed before this and they continued to be formed afterwards, the 1960s marks the moment for when the rapid expansion in the number of societies across the country. There were many reasons residents formed a historical society, ranging from creating a tourist attraction to encouraging pride in local history. But most often the motivation was based on timing, to preserve a local past that was in danger of being lost. And establishing a museum was the most popular way to do this. When interviewing the widow of a historical society founder in a small Western Plains, New South Wales town, she remarked that her husband respected the pioneers and revered them for their hardships they faced in settlement, and this had impelled him to initiate a historical society before it was too late. This sentiment is interesting and reveals a common theme in society and museum foundations, that there was a sense of inherited debt owed to those who built the town, and consequently the desire to honour their struggle was heightened when it seemed most in danger of being forgotten. Historical societies sat at the end of a unique relationship, a generational arc that started with the pioneers of the mid to late 19th century and ended in the 1960s when the advance of progress stalled and its memory became fragile. This created a unique moment of urgency, of collaboration and of collection. This moment was a race to preserve the local past before the memories and buildings had disappeared. Museum collections were amassed almost as quickly as the museums themselves sprung up. Items were inherited, acquired, or donated, with interesting implications for all three processes. Items that were inherited often came from natural, geological, or anthropological museums that began as small private collections, sometimes as early as the late 19th century. Placed in the local history museum, these items were redefined as historical, and this included the reinterpretation of Aboriginal items as historical rather than natural or anthropological, though this was not always done sensitively. Items by acquisitions were problematic, as societies often had little funds to spare on purchasing sought-after pieces. Items by donation formed a large part of the accumulation process, but also caused headaches for society members who in small towns could not refuse donations of the upteenth oil lamp from a known resident. Collections sometimes grew to be unruly, unmanageable, undocumented, and themeless. Sometimes historical threads and local significance were lost in the surge of collecting. And these are 4 views from the Gundagai Historical Society, which you just saw the outside of. I should add the 2 bottom ones are from newer sections that have been added on. The museum moment can also be placed by the advent of criticism from an emerging group of professional historians during the 1960s. John Alderson in 1967 and Eric Dunlop in 1968 both commented on the plethora of museums around Australia. However, Dunlop had more optimistic and practical sentiments to offer. Alderson lamented the lack of originality in non-specific folk museums, displaying common items, such as a collection of silver-frosted flat irons. The difficulty was that historical societies valued what these indiscriminate relics represented. In many ways, the criticism of folk museums failed to grasp this. For a short period of time, until the Heritage Act was introduced in 1977, the museums of local historical societies preceded any formal heritage framework. These museums provided spaces where the imagined past could be revisited and experienced. Societies collected items which demonstrated how everyday tasks were completed and created spaces where the past could be performed using props such as flat irons, oil lamps, and buggies. Some museums recreated domestic scenes or school classrooms. Interestingly, items did not have to be specific to the region, that was better if they were. For some places, the criteria of simply being old was good enough. The souvenir booklet from Bill Gandris' second Back To celebration in 1976 described its museum as a collection of folk articles. To the uninitiated, it may seem a load of junk, but to the more sensitive, the homely butter churn, the charcoal iron, the oil lamp, the candlestick, and the clothes of a bygone age tell more of the way in which people in this district lived than at the turn of the century than any history book. What is interesting here is that museums quickly came to pitch themselves as tourist attractions, bringing local benefits to town residents. But who were these museums actually for? Who were their audiences? The above comments reveal, as well as descriptions and criticisms do of museums at the time, that although museums were filled with seemingly indiscriminate objects, they were actually targeting a specific audience, the initiated, who could recognise the items and draw their own connections and interpretations through personal memory. Museums set up and maintained in this way could only ever exist in a momentary way, because eventually their new audiences could not bring the same understanding and appreciation to the collections that the initial generations could. During the 1970s, while museums continued to open and expand, local historical societies were diversifying their activities. A significant project which most historical societies undertook early on was to compile inventories of historical buildings in the town. They gathered photographs, information about these buildings, their former functions, what they looked like, and sometimes some historical intrigue would turn up along the way. Instead of modified buildings with no verandas, in monochrome colours and peppered with advertising, these informal inventories made it possible to visualise a very different looking historic country town than the one that was perhaps before their eyes. This is an interesting image quite a telling image from a tourist pamphlet from Mudgee. I think it's very interesting the connection between the idea of distinctive and the idea of being historical. History or heritage walks were becoming increasingly popular in the 1970s. Initially in country towns, one could find a list of notable historic buildings in, say, perhaps a tourist guide and a further direction to see the museum for pictures. From the mid-1970s, this evolved into separate pamphlets and then soon a pamphlet with a map. Towns such as Young and Mudgee Historical Society drafted historical drive and walk pamphlets in 1975 and found them so successful that they quickly needed reprinting. Information in heritage walks pamphlets drew largely on research conducted by historical societies. They encouraged tourists and residents to step outside the museum and experience the local past, to imagine what it would have looked like, and to create associations between the past and particular buildings. But the unforeseen problem was that heritage walks actually drew people away from the museum. Streets in country towns were reinterpreted as historical places, and one therefore did not need to visit the museum to experience the past. From the 1970s, it became apparent that local historical societies, particularly those who ran museums, were combating the challenges of depleting volunteer numbers and resources, and facing increasing competition from the growing number of professional history, heritage and tourist bodies. In the 1976 Back to Gilgandra souvenir, the Society lamented that since its establishment, enthusiasm has been muted. There have been setbacks, membership of the Historical Society has waned and waned. Likewise in the Muse, the Mudgee Historical Society's newsletter, the President wrote in 1984, "We are getting older and will soon be exhibits ourselves. If the Society is to continue to function, new members must be found." The Gundagai Historical Society had 73 members at its time of establishment in 1963. It had 280 by February 1964 and 471 by October that year. In 1991 it had 4 members, and the Lions, Rotary, Apex and the Services Club of Gundagai started to Save the Historical Society campaign. Its affiliation with the Royal Australian Historical Society lapsed in the 1990s. The focus had shifted from saving history to saving the Historical Society. So the popularity of heritage walks that meant that residents and tourists were stepping outside the museum to engage with and experience the past. And perhaps the most significant consequence of the popularity of heritage and history walks was that it brought increased focus on the aesthetic and eventually historic appeal of the town. Towns began to associate themes of history and heritage with their image and their buildings. Old buildings that were lost or pulled down were lamented, and opposition was expressed to the removal of verandas. Residents in country towns became particularly conscious of their main streets, perceiving them to be ugly or lacking in character. Because towns were undergoing the process of being reinterpreted as historical spaces by residents, councils, tourists and the professional heritage industry, buildings that did not fit the historic character became increasingly noticeable on these walks for all the wrong reasons. Following the establishment of the Heritage Council in 1977, towns and suburbs started to commission streetscape studies of their main streets and surrounds. Small in numbers at first, streetscape studies increased after the mid-1980s and tended to focus on country towns rather than urban areas. These studies aimed to document the heritage significance of main street sites and identify the contribution of historic buildings and places to the overall character of the town. After research was conducted into the Canadian Main Street program by Libby Ozinga from the New South Wales Department of Planning, the department launched its own Main Street program in 1988. The aim was the revitalisation of main streets in both urban and rural communities. The Main Street program ethos argued that the physical improvement of the town would enhance the town's unique sense of place and of character. The program regarded tourism as the real economic saviour, and this was to be discovered in the town's unique cultural or historical heritage. Facing population and economic decline, an economic boost was desired in country towns, and it appeared that their main streets had the potential to make them competitive players in the heritage tourism market. So it is no surprise that although the program had 5 points, it was the 5th point of heritage conservation which came to dominate the application of the program. Commissioned heritage consultants advised the rationalisation of aesthetic materials and aspects in the main street, including, and as you can see here, street furniture, tree planting, electrical cabling, traffic movement, gutter size, the visual aspects of the landscape, veranda reinstatement, and suggested what future development should look like. Like tourists and residents who were subconsciously noting places on heritage walks that did not fit, The study considered whether buildings were contributory or detracting to the historic character of the main street. At the core of this model was the belief that the historic character of place was the authentic one. Main Street ethos encouraged residents to restore the historic character of the main street, and the aesthetic transformation became known as town beautification. The majority of Main Street study recommendations included selecting a historic paint colour scheme and rationalising this scheme appropriately across all architectural periods. For modern buildings, a range of complementary colours were recommended, that is, colours that were complementary to heritage colours but not quite the same. Most modern buildings were not seen as sympathetic to the historic character of the main street and were therefore painted in tones that would not draw attention. In some cases, it was recommended that trees be deliberately planted in front of modern buildings to obscure them from view. Recommendations for heritage colours extended beyond buildings. Furniture included street lamps, post office boxes, chairs, benches, bins, bollards, and the list goes on. They were designed in heritage colours and in heritage styles. By 1996, 66 towns in New South Wales had undertaken the Main Street study, and 9 more were on its way. The Main Street program asked towns to identify what made them unique and to capitalise on this. The irony was that most country towns turned to their past to find what made them unique. In beautifying the streetscape and restoring the authentic historic character, main streets of country towns reflected the same colours schemes and prized heritage look. A rainbow of muted pinks, creams, and greens adorned the street. They were charming, they were quaint, but they were the same. And tourists came to see them and experience an imagined authentic country town. The Main Street program greatly contributed to the modelling of country towns as a destination in the past. Since the 1960s, engaging with the celebrated pioneer past in country towns has shifted from confined museum spaces to guided spaces in the town centre to a past that is physically emphasised in the main street. And I think you can see that transition here. These 2 images from Mudgee, you might recognise the bottom one, which is current day, and the top one, which I didn't recognise when I first found in the Historical Society collection. The spaces where the past is performed has expanded greatly, but perhaps performed is too strong a word. While local historical museums showed a clear distinct disconnect between the past, what was in the museum, and the present, what was outside, heritage walks promoted the idea that in fact the past was already in the town. The Main Street program went one step further, and celebrating this notion encouraged the idea that the authentic character of a country town was essentially an historical one. This shift in thinking has come with negative consequences for local historical societies, depleting their museums of visitors who seek a more subtle blurring of the past and the present. Thank you.